Thank you, John, and thank you, everyone. This has been really an amazing experience. And I was so pleased when I saw that the title of John's talk and the title of my talk were so totally similar, and yet we're talking about completely different topics, because I wanted to step back and look at the long-term time frame. And one of the questions that kept coming back to me in the back of my mind, because who had time in the middle of the crisis of the pandemic, but I kept thinking, what are we learning? What are we learning? What does this mean for long term? And that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about 1 year, 5 year, 10 year, 20 years. Where is our sector going, and what are the things we need to start doing now to be ready for it 5 years from now when the superintendent says to us, this is what I need you to do, and I need it tomorrow. Because for us, that means getting started now. And just to the vendors in the room, I want to be really clear. You play an essential role in this work, and specifically in some of what I'll talk about towards the end. It's going to be really important for you to get ready for the things we're going to ask you for that we're not asking you for yet. We obviously are in totally unpredictable times, but we have started to get a sense of what those unpredictable questions are that are facing us. We don't know what our enrollments are going to be. We know that our budgets have gone from massive cuts to massive investments through stimulus funds to a fiscal cliff 2 years from now that will be, for a lot of us, another reckoning. Thank you. So, at least in New York City, just one example, we had to take $1 billion budget cut in fiscal year, $1 billion budget cut in the spring of 2020 in order to just keep the city solvent. We don't talk about it a lot outside, but the city was very close to being completely bankrupt. And so every city agency took massive cuts. New York City took $1 billion. And then the stimulus funds passed, and we got $7 billion on top of a $38 billion budget. So it's almost 17% up. So we've had these wild swings. Thanks. Can you go to the next slide, please? In terms of enrollment, we had more enrollment loss than we were used to. So we had an extra 40,000 students leave the school system from the 2020 to this fall 21 school year. We don't quite know if they left in that spring of 20 or in the past school year. And we've had fluctuations in staffing, as you've all had. We've had fluctuations in weather. So there's so much going on that makes things feel volatile. And yet, we are responsible for long-term planning, for making decisions that will actually affect the children going to school today, their children, and their grandchildren at a minimum. And that's why one of the principles I want to bring in as we make these long-term decisions is to use that 7 generations principle. Think about 7 generations forward. And to give you some context, 7 generations back is your great-grandparents, their great-grandparents. So if you knew your great-grandparents, and your great-grandparents had the great fortune of knowing their great-grandparents, it's actually not that far back, but that's how far back it goes. And so we need to be thinking about decisions with that kind of a time frame, because we are investing for long term. The second principle is that the earth does not care about politics. I have a very clear and not very secret set of politics. I'm quite confident that most people in the room actually probably don't share all of the extreme things I believe, which is great, actually. I appreciate that because it allows me to stand where I stand and have reasonable conversation with folks who think differently and learn from each other. But ultimately, the earth does not care about the politics. So if the state is an environment with carbon emissions goals, if it's not, if it's an environment with vaccine mandates or not, doesn't matter, because what's going to happen is going to be the physical reality. The third piece we've talked about already is that community resilience depends on school buildings. So we got a beautiful and painful reminder of how important school buildings are to communities. And community resilience requires our buildings to be available to people at times we didn't anticipate, in ways we didn't anticipate, and at times when other things are not available. So early in the conference, somebody made the comment, we all showed up to work, right, in the session with Kim. There wasn't an option to stay home for a lot of people in this room and for a lot of people who work for us. So that resilience relies on you and your team. So you're the source of the reliability of school buildings. School buildings are the source community resilience. And that community resilience, we need to think about it in a multi-generational perspective. So what does that mean? We talked already about all of the things that are changing and all of the kinds of volatility where we don't know exactly the enrollment, the budget, the weather, the community needs, but we know that there will be demands on us based on those factors. So here's my proposed action step number 1. And it's more than proposed. I really believe this is how it has got to be for us moving forward. And I want to acknowledge up front, New York City is not actually a leader on this because we find it incredibly challenging to have net zero energy buildings because of our space constraints. So I just want to, not only am I speaking to the choir, I'm not a good singer. So all new buildings should be net zero energy because first of all, any other path is going to mean you will be retrofitting in the near future. So that's not actually responsible capital planning. The second reason is that there are 2 kinds of states in the United States right now. There are states with an aging power grid and underinvestment in school facilities, as we learned this morning. And then there are states with those 2 factors, plus really ambitious emissions reductions goals. So whichever kind of state you're in, net zero energy makes sense long term. And that role as a community anchor really requires us thinking long term. So how do you actually have a school building that can survive and thrive in challenging settings? And I snuck next door during the presentation by one of the facilities leaders at UT Austin, how they were able to actually keep their power going during that whole catastrophe in Texas because they had their own plant. And I just want to pause here and say that I am so convinced that this net zero energy needs to be the floor, not the reach goal, not we're trying to do it. It needs to be what we're all doing now with new buildings. That I'm going to call on a conservative Republican to come join my liberal East Coast self up here, just hoping that he agrees with me, but maybe not. We'll see. Mike Wilson, would you please come up? And this is just to remind us all that the Earth doesn't care about our politics, right? And our budgets can benefit from this no matter what they are. So, Mike, anything you want to say on net zero energy buildings?
Well, thank you for exposing me. Oh,
I'm sorry.
Make sure you move a little way so you don't get hit with the tomato.
I'll stand in front.
So full disclosure, before I came to work for our school district as a director of facilities, I was on our board of education for 12 years. So 10 of those 12 years, I was either board vice chair or chairman. So there's nothing you can say or do to me because I've already been a board member. So I don't have much sympathy for what they're going through now because, anyway, long story. But our story is I'm Mike Wilson, part of the Warren County School Board and Warren County School District in Bowling Green, Kentucky. And we in many ways have been, however you want to describe it, progressive or forward-thinking. We've been a leader in a lot of different ways. We were the first school district in the state of Kentucky that had an energy manager. There was no requirement, state or otherwise, but we felt like we want to be prudent stewards of taxpayer dollars, so that energy is something we can control. So we're the first district to have a paid position energy manager, and that was the first domino that set us on the path to becoming the first school district in the nation to build a school of ICF construction or insulated concrete forms, which really helps our energy conservation, our energy usage, and also is a safe school in which to not only house our students but also our staff. But ICF construction safety is first and foremost, and has always been in our district the first priority that we have, safety for our students and our staff. And that building can withstand 250 mile per hour winds. Again, it's huge in our energy conservation. So that was the next step that fell. And it led us to the point where we had the first net zero energy school in the nation, Richardsville Elementary. It has been around for 11 years now. We have never paid an electricity bill in that building. As a matter of fact, we get a check back from our utility provider at the end of each year for the amount of electricity that we generate above and beyond what we use. Thank you. And I say that too because it was risky to be the first one to have an ICF constructed school because there were no predecessors to us and we didn't know how that would perform. There were no net zero energy schools before us, so we didn't know if this was going to crash and burn or if it was going to be successful. But I want to encourage you to strongly, at the end of the day, the school board in your area has to make the decision on whether or not to do it. But this isn't new technology. If you want to look at it, we don't set ourselves up to be guinea pigs, but we want to be early adopters. And we felt like, and I felt like as the guy that raised the taxes on my community members, my neighbors, that I wanted to make sure that we did everything we possibly could to squeeze every penny out of every dollar before I went out and asked for more taxpayer dollars. So to date, we have 2 net zero energy schools. But on top of that, every school that we build is net zero energy ready. We have constructed ICF, geothermal heating and cooling, LED lighting. We just finished up a guaranteed energy savings contract with CMTA, who are based in Louisville, Lexington, Kentucky. We are now the most energy efficient school district in the state of Kentucky, and I don't know where that puts us in the nation, but we've got to be at the top. And again, in Kentucky, school board positions are nonpartisan. So I'm on a board of 5 members. I'm the conservative Republican. My counterpart is the tax and spend Democrat. But at the end of the day, but I say that because we would have every year in Kentucky, the state permits us to increase our property taxes up to 4%, not subject to recall. And he would get this hand wringing, oh, we got to raise taxes, we got to raise taxes. I'm like, dude, it's public education. I mean, we talk about being the anchors in our community in a lot of different ways. I don't bat an eye at that. I don't apologize for that. I'm the only elected official that I can take you to my school and I can show you the little kids in the orange uniforms. I can show you where every one of your pennies, taxpayer dollars goes. It gets harder and harder the farther away when it goes to the state capital or Washington, D.C. But I can justify those and do it quite well. But I feel like, in my opinion, Mike Wilson's opinion, every municipal, public funded building, whether it's a school, city hall, fire department, whatever, should be built to these standards because it makes sense in a lot of different ways. And so I don't care if you come from the left, the right, the center. At the end of the day, I'm just concerned that we have buildings that are sustainable for the long term because the decision, I never worried about getting reelected. I figured I'm going to make the best decision that I can, and if I get reelected, fine. If I don't, then I've made the best decision. I can go to my friends in the community and say I was a good steward of your taxpayer dollars, but also I built a good school building that you can send your kids. They're safe, they're warm in the winter, they're cool in the summer, it's well lit, and so it's the best environment for them to learn in, and also the best environment for our staff to work in. And I make no apologies for that.
Thank you so much, Michael. So I will admit it was a little bit staged because I did know what Mike thinks about this topic. It wasn't just a coming together across partisan lines and all that, but that is actually there on this topic because communities that are committed to really, really stringent fiscal management want to look at net zero energy. Communities that are committed to carbon emissions because of a set of goals in New York City, we passed a series of local laws that require phasing out of the majority of the fuel sources for New York City school buildings by 2030, which for us is like the day after tomorrow, right? 2021 to 2030 is approximately half an hour in most people's lives. For us, it's very short. So all of the new buildings should go to net zero energy because down the road, that's what is going to be demanded of us. That said, that's just action step number 1. Net zero is a good start, but there's a lot more to do. So you're probably all familiar with scopes, emission scopes, scope 1, which is what is actually burned in the district from the assets. If you own your own buses, those are in scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are from the consumption of purchased energy. So when we talk about net zero energy buildings, we're talking about scope 1 and 2. When we talk about building infrastructure, that's usually most of what we talk about. But scope 3 emissions is everything else. And it turns out that scope 1 and 2 is mostly the tip of the iceberg. And scope 3 is where most of the emissions are. The things we buy, the assets we lease. So for those of us who have school buses that are leased or contracted for, the waste stream of everything we buy and don't use. Scope 3 is coming for us, and we're not having a whole lot of conversation about it as school district. But that is what's going to come next. So everyone is now focused on the energy questions, and we're getting used to that. But by the time we're used to that, there's going to be a new set of requirements for us. And here's an illustrative example using Barnard College for 2 reasons. One is that New York City schools don't yet track scope 3 emissions. And the other is that my sister is actually the director of sustainability at Barnard. And so they've actually done this work of trying to figure out what the scope 3 emissions are. The scope 3 are the purple. So scope 1, you can see it's actually very significant. That's where the net zero energy buildings come in A and B. Really important. The green is scope 2. look at scope 3, and this is true for most institutions. 50 to 60% of the emissions associated with the enterprise are in scope 3. People commuting to work to get to the offices and schools, including, by the way, for us, the older students who drive to high school. The travel, this conference is the scope 3 emissions. And I would argue worth it, but all of the solid waste that we produce, the food, the cost of producing the food that we serve, and then the food when it enters the waste stream, the paper, the markers, the crayons, the origami cranes that we all make, all of that stuff, which is great and important, the microscopes in the labs. I'm not saying we shouldn't be consuming these items at all. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is our work in facilities over the next decade is going to start to focus on this scope 3 work. And it's good for us to get a head start, even as we are dealing with all of what John Bailey just listed as these very real-time questions that are in front of us. The best time to start? Today, right? So starting to work on scope 3, what does that mean? We've already seen supply chain challenges. We see the fiscal cliff, and we see this continuing pressure to reduce emissions. Those 3 factors are going to combine to put pressure on us. So on the supply chain end, and this one is really for the vendors too, the things that you're selling us, we're going to come to you and say we want them to be different. Or you can even get a head start and say, you know what I don't want to do anymore? I don't want to ship you water in the form of cleaning supplies. I want to ship just the cleaning supplies and you add the water. You know what I don't want to do anymore? I don't want to ship you material that you're not going to use. All of those questions, you can come to us with ideas and we'll come to you with ideas. How quickly we do that is going to depend on really the people in this room. And in terms of the fiscal cliff, one of the things we need to get ready for is what school budgets are going to look like 2.5 years from now. We have no idea, but chances are it's not going to be like what it is today. And so one of the opportunities we have now is to get ready for more circular local economy principles to help us with that process. So here's how to start on scope 3 emissions. The first is to measure it. And it's very hard because it's not in BTUs. It's in the volume of food waste you have. It's actually complicated to do, but it can be done, and there are efforts afoot to make it easier. The second is to hedgehog it. This is not something where you're going to overnight go from where you are now to a 50% reduction. It's going to take a series of small actions and teaching and learning new habits. To Cynthia's point about in Baltimore, about teaching everyone in a net zero energy building the different ways of interacting with the space and the different habits people need to learn. Similarly, we're going to need to learn different habits around the food that goes on trays, on how we put that food away, the paper that we buy and use. All of the stuff we're going to have to interact with differently. And one of the ways we can start to do that is by looking at the circular economy principles of, if I have markers in my school that I don't need, and you have paint in your school that you don't need, how can we start to trade that and still have honest budgeting so that we recognize that I'm supposed to spend money on the students in my school and you're supposed to spend money on the students in your school, so we have a way to think about that supply in a way where we can really see that we're still benefiting the kids we are ethically bound to benefit, but also we're not doing that end of year, let's spend down our fiscal dollars and then just warehousing stuff that we don't need that somebody else could use that they're then also buying. So the scope 3 emissions, again, coming for us. This is one of those things where you don't have to do this today, but I want to plant the seed because it is going to be our work in the years ahead. So due dates, these are not my due dates. These are just what I think is going to be happening in the policy environment. We're all very live in the conversation around net zero energy buildings. Now, I think 1 to 5 years, we won't be building buildings unless they're net zero energy or have some other major way of addressing the energy demands. In 5 to 10 years, we're going to need to have real answers on energy resilience and independence so that schools can keep functioning even if the grid is not functioning. And in 10 to 20 years, we're all going to be required to have ways to address the scope 3 emissions. And again, for us, 10 years can feel like 1,000 given the last 2 years, but it's also very, very soon for long-term planning. So this is why I wanted to raise today this notion of scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 emissions, scope 2 emissions, we have answers to those emerging. Scope 3 is coming for us, and we should get to it before it comes and knocks us over. And that is what I wanted to leave you with around long-term planning. Thank you.